The most amazing summers I ever had was in a town called Burney, California in 1963. I was 11 years old, and I stayed there with my grandmother once for an entire year. I went to school there, and we stayed in this little house that was once part of a logging mill that had been there a long time ago, now since long abandoned. It sat on the edge of a forest, surrounded by nature, and best of all, at night, the most amazing stars you could ever imagine. It was a paradise for an 11-year-old child, and my grandmother was an amazing lady. The house was quite old, very log cabin-like, and very rustic. Inside was a basic old television set, a fireplace that kept us warm all night in the cold of the mountain altitude. Burney was at over 3,000 feet, and even during the summer at night, it was quite cold there. My grandmother was an amazing woman. She was a brilliant scientist, chemist, photographer. She worked for Ansel Adams for years. I remember well going to his house, often to have dinner. She photographed lightning storms. She photographed a chrysalis that hung from our fireplace of a monarch butterfly in stages of development as it became a butterfly. One of my favorite things to do there was to go out, across the porch into the front yard, and lay down in the tall grass at my favorite tree and look up at the stars. I would imagine lying on my back that I was against a ceiling, and if I hold on to the grass very tightly, I wouldn't fall into the stars, and then I would let myself fall into the stars. On some nights, I would wake up to something that reminded me of a calling. Much like in Superman, with Christopher Reeves, the crystal singing at night, I felt compelled to get up and look at the stars. After that, I just had to go outside. I just had to look. So I'd go through the house. The fire would be burning. My grandparents would be sound asleep. But I would go out through the front door into the night. And there was the barn. It was a huge shed that once been used by the logging business there. There was a light shining on top of it. I don't know if that was a yard light or if it was something else. But as I approached it, as always, I felt like I was going to school, and there was this shadowy figure in the corner. I could barely make him out. I almost felt like I imagined him, but he would tell me all these amazing things about the stars, about nature, and my relationship to them. And then he would just fade away. It was late evening, and my grandparents needed some groceries. So we went into town. And when we got there, it was very quiet, very dark, and everybody was gone. The place was closed down. So we drove through for a while, hoping to find someplace open, but we never did. So my grandparents decided to move on and drive on to the next town, which wasn't very far away. But it meant taking a route that wound through a country road in the forest of the mountain area of Burney. As we drove along, I would look out the back window up at the stars. I was always looking for something. I always felt like I was being watched. In my mind, I imagined that something was watching me. I knew about the saucers. I had seen them quite often as a child growing up, both staying in the country with my grandparents and living in the city. As we drove along the road, my grandparents were quiet, and so was I. I don't know, it just felt like something was going to happen, and we felt it. But they kept driving and driving, hoping to get to the town. And then it happened. We're driving along, and I see this bright light in the woods off to the side, and men standing in the road. There were men standing in the road, and they stopped our car. My grandparents just seemed to stare as if they were hypnotized. The men kept pointing at us, and then they started to walk forward towards the car. And as they did, my grandparents passed out as if they had just fallen asleep. But I was still awake, very much awake, and watching everything that went on. The men approached the car. They didn't say anything. They just looked at us. I was looking at the object and the structure inside the forest, and then a man walked over and started pointing at me. My grandparents were still out cold. And then the doors were opened, and my grandparents were taken out. And as they were taken out, they were just sort of hung over, stiff, and floating, slightly dragging their feet. It reminded me of Barney and Betty Hill. And they took him towards the structure. And this man stood over me and asked me to get out of the car, and I did so on my own. I followed my grandparents and the men towards the structure, which now clearly looked like some sort of saucer or craft. There were other men waiting for us, also dressed in workmen's clothes. I had no fear, none whatsoever. It's almost as though it had been driven out of me. I was fascinated, and as we moved towards the craft, there was a bright light coming out of the door. As we got closer, it was very, very bright, and we were taken inside. The next thing I knew, we were walking down a long corridor. My grandparents being floated along, dragging their feet, a man standing next to me. We were being taken to a room towards the end of the hallway. It seemed like it took forever to get there. I looked around. Everything was metallic and metal. There was light, but no source for where it came from. There were no bulbs from the ceiling or any kind of fixture. They continued moving us towards the opening at the end of the corridor, and that's when I saw the two beings standing there. They were clearly not human, and they seemed familiar to me. We had seen each other before. They sat me one of the tables inside this room. My grandparents were put on the opposite tables and laid down, asleep. The tall being standing over me said, "We needed to check on you. We needed to do a checkup." They asked me to lay down on the table, and I did so willingly. There was no fear. I wasn't paralyzed. She looked over me. I could hear her. "He's fine. You're fine. You're going to be okay. We just needed to do a checkup." She looked at me for quite some time, and then she bent over. She said something to one of the other ones, the smaller grays nearby, but she looked into my eyes, and I felt this compassion, this caring, that to this day I still know very well. She says, "We're not going to hurt you. You'll be back in your car soon. You're just going to go to sleep, and when you wake up, you'll be in the car, driving along your way." Next thing I knew, I'm sitting in the back of the car and looking out the window at the stars. We had a sense that something had gone on. We didn't know exactly what. They went to the next town. It was closed, and when they looked at their watches, they realized that we had lost 2 hours of time they couldn't count for. In my mind, I imagined the craft we saw going back to its home world, as I often would do at that age. I wanted to go with them. I wanted to know what it was like, but yet I knew what it was like. I felt it in my heart. As I traveled down this wormhole of my imagination, I wonder now, was I imagining it, or did I actually experience this at one time? It's so beautiful. It brings up such emotion in me, and it just seems like something that really happened to me. This will always be the most amazing experience in my life, and it continues to this day.